Karen thought she could get away with it, dumping her trash on my lawn under the cover of night. But she didn't know I had a secret weapon: environmental inspectors who would uncover her toxic mess and force her to pay a hefty fine. Now she's about to learn a hard lesson. You can't mess with Mother Nature or your neighbor. I still remember that fateful night when I first discovered Karen's toxic dumping ground on my pristine lawn. It was around 2 a.m. when I heard a loud crash outside, jolting me awake from a restless sleep. Grabbing my robe and flashlight, I cautiously peeked out the window, only to be greeted by a horrifying sight. There, under the moonlight, was Karen, my next-door neighbor and town busybody, frantically shoveling what looked like industrial waste onto my property. Bags of noxious chemicals, leaking barrels, and piles of unidentifiable refuse were being unceremoniously dumped onto the grass I had so carefully tended to for years. My heart raced as I watched in disbelief. How dare she desecrate my lawn with her toxic waste? Rage bubbled up inside me, but I knew I had to act fast and decisively. Quickly, I placed a call to the local Environmental Protection Agency, describing the scene in vivid detail and pleading for immediate action. Within minutes, the familiar sound of sirens pierced the still night air. Flashing lights illuminated the stark reality unfolding on my front lawn as a team of inspectors descended upon Karen's illegal dumping operation. She froze, caught red-handed, as the agents swarmed her, demanding answers. "Ma'am, you're in serious violation of environmental protection laws," the lead inspector barked, donning a hazmat suit. "This toxic waste you've dumped is a threat to the entire neighborhood. You're going to have to pay a hefty fine for the cleanup." Karen's face drained of color as the gravity of her actions hit her. But I was just trying to save money on disposal fees," she stammered, her voice laced with panic. The inspector's eyes narrowed. "That's no excuse. You've put the health and safety of your community at risk. We're impounding your vehicle and issuing you a citation. You can expect a bill for thousands of dollars in the mail." Watching Karen's world crumble before her was a bittersweet moment. On one hand, I felt a sense of vindication for the outrage she had inflicted upon me. But on the other, I couldn't help but wonder how this would impact our already strained relationship as neighbors. As the inspectors finished documenting the scene and began the arduous cleanup process, I stood there, clutching my robe tightly, a mix of emotions swirling inside me. Part of me reveled in the sweet taste of justice, while another part dreaded the fallout that was sure to come. After all, Karen was not known for taking defeat gracefully, and I had a feeling this was only the beginning of a much bigger battle. The next morning, I awoke to the sound of frantic knocking at my door. Shuffling to the entryway, I peered through the peephole to find Karen, her face flushed with fury. "Open up, you snitch," she spat the moment I unlocked the door. "How dare you call the environmental inspectors on me?" I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm in the face of her rage. "Karen, you were illegally dumping toxic waste on my property. I had no choice but to report it." "No choice," she scoffed, eyes narrowing to slits. "You could have just let me handle it discreetly. Now I've got a massive fine to pay, all because you had to be the hero." I crossed my arms over my chest, refusing to back down. "That's not how it works, Karen. You can't just dump hazardous materials wherever you please. There are laws against that for a reason, to protect the community." "Well, now you've really done it," she hissed, jabbing a finger in my direction. "This isn't over. You mark my words. You're going to pay for this, one way or another." With that, she spun on her heel and stormed off, leaving me to wonder just what kind of retaliation she had in mind. I couldn't help but feel a twinge of unease. Karen was never one to take defeat lying down. Throughout the day, I found myself constantly on edge, jumping at every sound and movement outside. The inspectors had assured me that the cleanup would be thorough, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen was plotting something sinister. As night fell, I paced the length of my living room, eyes constantly darting to the windows. I had to be vigilant, ready to spring into action at the first sign of trouble. Karen had made it clear that she wasn't going to let this go, and I needed to be prepared for whatever she had in store. Just as I was about to give in to exhaustion, a sudden crashing sound outside sent my heart racing. Rushing to the window, I peered out, only to see a large object hurtling towards my car. Before I could react, the windshield shattered, and glass rained down onto the driveway. "No," I cried, flinging open the door and dashing outside. There, in the dim streetlight, I could make out the unmistakable shape of a brick, a note attached to it. Bending down, I gingerly picked up the object, my hands trembling. Unfolding the paper, I read the words scrawled in Karen's familiar handwriting. "This is just the beginning. Sleep with one eye open, neighbor." A chill ran down my spine as the gravity of the situation hit me. Karen had escalated from illegal dumping to outright vandalism and threats. I knew then that I was in for a battle, one that would test the limits of my resolve and my ability to keep my cool in the face of her relentless retaliation. The next morning, I awoke with a heavy heart, my mind racing with the events of the previous night. Karen's brazen act of vandalism had shaken me to the core, and I knew I couldn't let my guard down for a second. As I stepped outside to survey the damage to my car, a familiar figure caught my eye. There, across the street, stood Karen, her arms folded across her chest, a smug expression on her face. When our eyes met, she offered a patronizing wave, her lips curling into a sinister grin. Clenching my fists, I marched over to her, fuming. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Karen? Throwing bricks at my car? That's vandalism, and I won't stand for it." Karen's expression remained unchanged, her voice dripping with condescension. "I have no idea what you're talking about, dear. I was simply enjoying my morning stroll, minding my own business. If your car happened to get damaged, well, that's hardly my concern now, is it?" I could feel the anger boiling inside me, but I knew I had to keep my composure. "Don't play dumb with me, Karen. I found the brick with your little note attached. You're trying to intimidate me, and it's not going to work." "Intimidate you?" Karen scoffed, her eyes narrowing. "I'm not sure what you're implying, but I can assure you that I have no interest in engaging in any kind of petty feud with you. If your car was damaged, I'm sure the authorities will be able to get to the bottom of it." I opened my mouth to retort, but the sound of an approaching vehicle caught my attention. Turning, I watched as a sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb, and a well-dressed man stepped out. "Ma'am, I'm Agent Johnson from the Environmental Protection Agency," he said, approaching Karen with a stern expression. "We've received some concerning reports about continued illegal dumping on your property. I'm going to need you to come with me to the station for questioning." Karen's face drained of color as the agent spoke, and she quickly tried to compose herself. "I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding, officer." "I haven't been." "Save it, ma'am," Agent Johnson interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. "We have evidence, and we're not going to tolerate any further violations of environmental regulations. Now, if you'll come with me, we can sort this out at the station." As the agent escorted a visibly shaken Karen to the car, I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. It seemed that the authorities were taking my concerns seriously, and Karen's attempts at retaliation were quickly unraveling. But even as I watched her being driven away, a nagging feeling of unease tugged at the back of my mind. Karen was resourceful, and I knew she wouldn't give up that easily. This was far from over, and I needed to be ready for whatever she had in store next. As the days passed, I found myself in a state of heightened vigilance, constantly on the lookout for any sign of Karen's retaliation. The damage to my car had been repaired, but the lingering unease refused to subside. I had hoped that her arrest and questioning by the environmental inspectors would deter her from further mischief, but Karen was not one to be easily discouraged. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was biding her time, plotting her next move. One afternoon, as I was tending to my garden, a strange vehicle caught my eye. It was an unfamiliar pickup truck, slowly cruising down the street, its driver's face obscured by a baseball cap. My heart raced as I watched it turn the corner and disappear from view. Moments later, the mailman arrived, handing me a thick envelope with a return address I didn't recognize. Tearing it open, I found a stack of documents that sent a chill down my spine. They were all related to various environmental regulations and violations. Frantically, I scanned the pages, my mind racing. The documents detail a litany of alleged infractions on my part, from illegal dumping to improper storage of hazardous materials. They seemed to be a carefully crafted dossier, designed to cast me as the villain in this ongoing saga. My hands trembled as I realized the magnitude of Karen's retaliation. She had somehow managed to turn the tables, using the very system that had caught her in the act to target me. The threat of fines, legal action, and even potential criminal charges loomed large, and I knew I had to act fast. Rushing to my computer, I began frantically researching environmental regulations, determined to understand the implications of these accusations. As I delved deeper, a glimmer of hope emerged. Many of the alleged violations seemed to be fabricated or exaggerated, relying on technicalities and ambiguous language. With a renewed sense of determination, I set out to gather evidence and build my case. I scoured my property, meticulously documenting every aspect of my waste management practices, and reached out to local environmental agencies for guidance. The battle lines had been drawn, and I knew that Karen was not going to make this easy. But I was no longer the passive victim. I was a fighter, ready to take on this challenge head-on. This was my home, my community, and I wasn't about to let Karen's vindictive schemes tear it all apart. As the sun began to set, I settled in front of my computer, ready to craft a response that would leave no doubt about my commitment to environmental responsibility. Karen may have thought she had the upper hand, but I was determined to prove her wrong, and I would stop at nothing to protect my reputation and my way of life. Over the next few days, I poured my heart and soul into crafting a comprehensive rebuttal to Karen's accusations. I meticulously documented every aspect of my waste management practices, leaving no stone unturned. Armed with a stack of evidence, I felt cautiously optimistic that I could expose the truth and clear my name. When the day of the hearing arrived, I arrived at the local environmental agency's office with a sense of nervous anticipation. Karen, of course, was already there, her posture radiating an air of smug confidence. As the proceedings began, I presented my case with unwavering determination. I shared the detailed records of my recycling efforts, the proper storage and disposal of any hazardous materials, and the certifications I had obtained to ensure my compliance with all relevant regulations. The inspectors listened intently, their brows furrowed in concentration. I could feel the tension in the room as Karen's accusations were systematically dismantled, one by one. Finally, the lead inspector stood up, clearing his throat. "Well, Ms. Smith, it appears that your neighbor's claims are largely unfounded. Your waste management practices seem to be exemplary, and we find no evidence of any significant violations on your part." Karen's face flushed with a mix of anger and embarrassment as the inspector continued. "In fact, we've uncovered several instances where your neighbor, Miss Karen, has provided false or misleading information in an attempt to discredit you. This will certainly be taken into account when determining the appropriate course of action." I couldn't help but feel a surge of triumph as the tables turned. Karen's carefully constructed web of lies was unraveling before our very eyes, and I couldn't help but savor the moment. "So, what happens now?" I asked, my voice steady and confident. The inspector's expression darkened. "Well, Ms. Smith, we'll be referring this matter to the district attorney's office for potential prosecution. Ms. Karen's actions could be considered harassment, and she may face significant fines and even jail time if the charges are substantiated." Karen's eyes widened in horror, and she began to protest, but the inspector raised a hand to silence her. "Save it, ma'am. You've had your chance to make your case, and it's clear you've abused the system. The consequences of your actions are about to catch up with you." As the inspectors escorted a fuming Karen out of the room, I let out a long, deep breath. The weight of the past few weeks had been overwhelming, but now I finally felt a sense of vindication. Karen's underhanded attempts to ruin me had backfired spectacularly, and the tables had well and truly turned. As I made my way home, I couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of pride in my community and the system that had ultimately protected me. Perhaps, in the end, justice would prevail, and Karen would learn a hard lesson about the consequences of her actions. In the aftermath of the hearing, the news of Karen's undoing spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. Word of her failed attempt to frame me for environmental violations quickly made the rounds, and I found myself the recipient of a wave of support and sympathy from my fellow residents. Neighbors who had previously avoided me or sided with Karen now sought me out, offering apologies and expressing outrage at her deceitful actions. It was as if a veil had been lifted, and the community could finally see her for the manipulative and vindictive person she truly was. Even the local environmental agency seemed to take a personal interest in ensuring that justice was served. They expedited the investigation into Karen's illegal dumping and provided me with regular updates on the case, reassuring me that she would face the full consequences of her crimes. As the days passed, I watched with a mix of relief and trepidation as the legal wheels began to turn. Karen, it seemed, had finally met her match, and the prospect of her facing serious penalties for her misdeeds filled me with a sense of vindication. But even as I reveled in the knowledge of her impending downfall, a nagging feeling of unease persisted. Karen was a formidable opponent, and I knew she would not go down without a fight. She had already demonstrated a willingness to stoop to the lowest depths to achieve her aims, and I couldn't help but wonder what other tricks she might have up her sleeve. One evening, as I was preparing dinner, a knock at the door startled me. Cautiously, I peered through the peephole, only to find a familiar face, the lead inspector from the environmental agency. "Good evening, Mr. Smith," he said, his expression grave. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news to share with you." My heart sank as I opened the door, bracing myself for the worst. "What is it?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The inspector's brow furrowed with concern. "It appears that Ms. Karen has fled the area. We've been unable to locate her, and she's failed to show up for her scheduled court appearance." I felt my stomach drop. "So, what does that mean for the case?" The inspector sighed heavily. "It means that the prosecution is going to be significantly more challenging. Without her present, we'll have a harder time building a solid case against her. And the longer she remains at large, the more difficult it will be to hold her accountable." I swallowed hard, processing the implications of this latest development. Karen had managed to evade the authorities, and now the burden of ensuring she faced justice rested squarely on my shoulders. "What can I do to help?" I asked, determination etched across my face. The inspector offered a slight nod. "We'd appreciate any information you can provide about her whereabouts or potential hiding spots. And if you happen to spot her, please don't confront her, just call us immediately. We'll take it from there." As the inspector departed, I closed the door, my mind racing. Karen had once again slipped through the cracks, and I knew that the road ahead would be arduous. But I was more resolute than ever to see this through, to ensure that she faced the consequences of her actions, and that justice was ultimately served. The days that followed were filled with a sense of unease and uncertainty. With Karen on the run, the prospect of her being held accountable for her crimes seemed to be slipping further and further away. I found myself constantly on high alert, scanning the neighborhood for any sign of her familiar face. The inspectors had assured me that they were doing everything in their power to track her down, but their efforts seemed to be hitting one dead end after another. As the weeks turned into months, the case began to take a toll on me both physically and mentally. The stress of not knowing where Karen was or what she might be planning next weighed heavily on my mind, and I found it increasingly difficult to focus on my daily life. One evening, as I was settling in for the night, a sudden movement outside caught my eye. Peering through the window, I saw a figure darting across my lawn, a figure that looked suspiciously like Karen. My heart raced as I watched, torn between the urge to confront her and the inspector's warning to avoid direct confrontation. Before I could decide on a course of action, the figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving me with a growing sense of unease. Had it truly been Karen, or was I simply succumbing to my own paranoia? The uncertainty only served to heighten my anxiety, and I found myself tossing and turning well into the night. The following morning, as I stepped outside to retrieve the newspaper, I noticed a small envelope tucked under the doormat. Bending down, I cautiously picked it up, my fingers trembling as I tore it open. Inside was a single piece of paper, bearing a message scrawled in Karen's familiar handwriting. "You thought you had won, didn't you? But the game's far from over, my dear neighbor. Watch your back." A chill ran down my spine as I read the words, the implications of the threat sending a wave of dread through me. Karen was still out there, still plotting her revenge, and I knew I couldn't let my guard down for a single moment. Clutching the note in my hand, I rushed to the phone and dialed the inspectors, relaying the latest developments. They promised to increase patrols in the area and assured me that they were doing everything in their power to locate Karen and bring her to justice. But as I hung up the phone, I couldn't shake the nagging feeling that Karen was always one step ahead. She had evaded capture once before, and I knew that she would stop at nothing to achieve her twisted goals. The battle lines had been drawn, and I steeled myself for the fight of my life. The weeks that followed were a harrowing ordeal, as I found myself constantly on edge, anticipating Karen's next move. The inspectors had stepped up their efforts, but it seemed that every time they thought they had a lead, she managed to slip through their fingers. I became increasingly isolated, wary of venturing too far from home, afraid that Karen might be lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce. My once vibrant neighborhood had become a minefield of uncertainty, and I found myself questioning whether I would ever truly feel safe again. Then, one fateful night, as I was locking up the house, a sudden noise from the backyard caught my attention. Cautiously, I peered out the window, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the dim light, I could make out a shadowy figure moving stealthily through the garden. Without hesitation, I grabbed my phone and dialed the inspectors, my voice trembling as I described the intruder. Within minutes, the familiar sound of sirens pierced the night air, and a team of officers converged on my property. As they apprehended the figure, I watched with bated breath, praying that this would finally be the end of Karen's reign of terror. To my relief, the inspectors emerged moments later, leading a handcuffed and disheveled Karen to the waiting patrol car. "We got her," the lead inspector exclaimed, a triumphant grin on his face. "She was caught red-handed, trying to sabotage your home. This time, there's no way she's getting out of it." I let out a long, deep breath, the weight of the past months lifting from my shoulders. Finally, after all the chaos and uncertainty, justice had prevailed. Karen's undoing had been her own undoing, and I couldn't help but feel a sense of vindication. As the officers drove her away, I turned my gaze to the night sky, a newfound sense of peace washing over me. The battle had been long and arduous, but in the end, I had emerged victorious. Karen's attempts to destroy me had backfired, and the community had rallied to support me, unwilling to tolerate her disruptive and dangerous behavior. In the days that followed, the news of Karen's arrest and impending prosecution spread like wildfire through the neighborhood. My neighbors, once wary and distrustful, now showered me with praise and gratitude, thankful that the scourge of our community had finally been brought to justice. As I settled back into my routine, I couldn't help but reflect on the lessons learned from this harrowing ordeal. It had tested the limits of my resilience and forced me to confront my own vulnerabilities. But in the end, I had emerged stronger, more determined than ever to protect what was rightfully mine. And as for Karen, well, she would soon learn that the price of her misdeeds was far greater than she could have ever imagined. The wheels of justice were in motion, and this time there would be no escape.